I inherited my uncle's lake house in March. I'd only been there twice as a kid, and he'd lived alone for the last 15 years. The lawyer said he'd been dead about 4 days before anyone found him. Heart attack. Quick. The house had been sitting empty for 2 months by the time I got the keys. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon to assess what needed doing before I could sell it. The place was 2 hours north, buried in pine woods at the end of a gravel road. No neighbors within a half mile. I got there around 3. The air was still cold, that wet early spring cold that gets into your coat. The house was smaller than I remembered. 1-story wood siding that needed paint, a deck facing the water. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the smell of old coffee and dust. The heat was off. My breath made small clouds. I walked through the living room, the kitchen, checked the 2 bedrooms. Everything looked normal. Furniture covered in a thin layer of dust. Mail stacked on the counter. A coffee mug in the sink. I turned the heat on and heard the furnace kick to life in the basement. That's when I noticed the silence. Not the silence itself. That made sense. Empty house, middle of nowhere, middle of the week. But there was a quality to it I didn't like. It didn't feel like the silence of a place that had been empty for 2 months. It felt like the silence of a place where something had just stopped moving. I stood in the kitchen and listened. Nothing. No hum of appliances. No birds outside. No wind. Just the furnace running below me and my own breathing. I told myself I was being stupid. I'd driven 2 hours, I was tired, the house smelled like death, an old man living. Of course it felt weird. I opened the fridge. Empty except for condiments and a carton of milk that had separated into layers. I closed it and checked the cabinets. Canned soup, crackers, coffee. I'd brought groceries, enough for 2 days. I put them away and kept listening. Around 5, I walked down to the lake. The water was slate gray and still. The dock needed boards replaced. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just looking at the water, and the whole time I had the feeling I should turn around. Not because I heard something, because I didn't. When I came back to the house, I checked all the locks. Front door, back door, the door to the deck. All locked. Windows latched. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter as the light outside turned blue. I tried to read. I'd brought a book, but I kept stopping to listen. The furnace would cycle off and the silence would come back, and every time it felt thicker, more deliberate. At 8, I called my wife. The call went through, but the connection was bad, breaking up every few seconds. I told her I'd arrived. She asked if I was okay. I said yes. We hung up. My phone showed 2 bars. I turned on the TV just for noise. The antenna only picked up 1 channel, some old sitcom I didn't recognize. I left it on and went to brush my teeth. The bathroom was at the end of the hall. Small window above the toilet, shower with a plastic curtain. I brushed my teeth and kept the door open so I could hear the TV. When I spit and turned off the water, I realized the TV had gone silent, not off. I could still see the light from the living room, but no sound. I walked back down the hall. The TV was still on. A commercial playing, but no sound. I checked the volume. It was up. I turned it off and then on again. Nothing. I unplugged it and left it. The silence came back, and this time I was sure. It wasn't empty. It was full of something waiting. I checked my phone. 8:47. I thought about driving back home, but that felt insane. 2 hours in the dark because a TV stopped working and I'd creeped myself out. I went to the bedroom, the one that had been my uncle's. The bed was made. I pulled back the comforter and checked the sheets. They looked clean. I lay down fully dressed and kept the bedside lamp on. I didn't sleep. I lay there listening for 2 hours. The furnace kicked on and off. The house settled. Wind picked up outside and I could hear branches brushing the roof. All normal sounds. But underneath them, or maybe between them, there was something else. Not a sound exactly. More like the space where a sound should be, like someone holding their breath. At 11, I got up and walked through the house again. I don't know what I thought I'd find. Everything was the same. Doors locked, windows latched. Nothing moved. I went back to bed and must have fallen asleep around midnight because I woke up at 2:14 according to my phone. The lamp was still on. The furnace was running. Someone had closed the bedroom door. I stared at it. I'd left it open. I was sure I'd left it open. I always sleep with doors open. I got up and opened it. The hallway was dark. I turned on the hall light and checked the other bedroom, the bathroom, the living room. Nothing. Everything exactly as I'd left it, except the coffee mug. The one that had been in the sink. It was on the counter now, upside down on a dish towel, drying. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Maybe I'd moved it and forgotten. Maybe I'd washed it without thinking. I was tired. Stressed. In a dead man's house. I went back to the bedroom and pushed a chair under the doorknob. Then I sat on the bed with my phone in my hand and waited for morning. The silence pressed against the walls. It wasn't waiting anymore. It knew I knew. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything. But at 4:33, I heard the chair move. Not fall. Just shift. Like someone had tested the door and found it blocked and decided not to push. I left at first light. I didn't pack. I grabbed my keys and walked out the front door and got in my car. I sold the house as is to the first buyer. I never went back. My wife asked me once why I was so willing to take a loss on it. I told her it needed too much work. She didn't push. I still don't like silence. I keep the radio on, the TV, something. Because I know now that silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's the sound of something being patient. I worked security at a storage facility for 8 months. It was a good job. Easy. 4 nights a week, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., just me and a tablet full of camera feeds. The place was huge, 3 buildings, climate-controlled units and regular units. The kind people stuffed with furniture they didn't want to throw away. Nothing ever happened. That was the appeal. I'd do my 2 walkthroughs, one at midnight and one at 4, and the rest of the time I sat in the office reading or watching videos on my phone. I'd see the occasional rat, once a raccoon. But no people, no break-ins, no drama. The only thing I didn't like was Building C. It was the oldest building farthest from the road. 2 stories, all climate-controlled. We kept it locked separately from the others because half the units were long-term renters who'd paid years in advance. Estate stuff mostly. People who died and their families just kept paying the fees instead of dealing with it. I had to check it like the others, but I always saved it for last. It wasn't that anything happened there. It was the opposite. It was too quiet. The other buildings had sounds. Metal expanding, the hum of ventilation, mice in the walls, normal sounds. Building C was silent in a way that felt deliberate, like it was trying not to be noticed. My supervisor, Randy, told me I was psyching myself out. He'd worked there for 6 years and never had a problem. Just walk through, check the locks, move on. I did. For 7 months, I did exactly that. Then in October, someone stopped paying on Unit 212. Randy told me before my shift on a Wednesday. Unit 212, second floor, Building C renter had defaulted. We'd sent notices for 60 days, no response. It was going to auction in 2 weeks, but I needed to do an inventory and make sure there was nothing perishable or hazardous inside. He gave me the key and a clipboard. I told him I'd handle it during my midnight walkthrough. I got to Building C at 12:20. I unlocked the main entrance and stepped into the hallway. Fluorescent lights, concrete floor, numbered doors, and white paint. The silence settled over me immediately. I took the stairs to the second floor. Unit 212 was halfway down the hall on the left. I stood in front of it and listened. Nothing. I unlocked it and lifted the rolling door. It made a loud metal rattle that echoed down the hall. I pulled it up all the way and reached for the light cord. The unit was maybe 10 by 15 feet, packed full. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, furniture pushed against the walls, trash bags stuffed with what looked like clothes, everything coated in dust. I stepped inside and started making notes. Boxes, approximately 50. 1 couch, 1 desk, lamps, typical estate cleanout. That's when I noticed the dust. It was thick on everything, except the floor. The floor had marks, faint scuff marks, recent. I crouched down and looked closer. They led from the door to the back corner, behind a stack of boxes. Like someone had walked back there. I stood up and looked at the boxes. They were stacked tight, but there was a gap, just wide enough. I told myself it was a rat. Or air current. Or the marks had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed. But I pulled out my flashlight and shined it into the gap. There was space back there, between the boxes and the wall, about 2 feet wide, just enough for someone to stand. I didn't go back there. I finished my notes, pulled the door down, and locked it. When I got back to the office, I checked the camera feed for Building C. We had one camera covering the entrance, one on each stairwell. I scrolled back through the last week. Nothing. No one had entered. I checked the last month. Still nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. The scuff marks could have been old. The dust could have settled unevenly. I was creeping myself out over nothing, but I kept thinking about the silence in that unit. It had the same quality as the hallway. Not empty. Occupied. I didn't tell Randy. I didn't want to sound insane. The next week, I avoided Building C. I did my walkthroughs of A and B, and I told myself C was fine. No alarms, no issues. I'd check it the following week. On my 4th shift, the power went out in Building C. The alarm didn't trip because it wasn't a break-in, just the breaker. It happened sometimes. I radioed Randy even though he was off duty, and he told me to go flip it. Breaker box was in the basement access, 1st floor around the back. I got there at 1:15 a.m. The building was completely dark. My flashlight cut a thin beam through the hallway. I found the basement door and went down. Concrete steps, metal rail, smell of damp. The breaker box was on the far wall. I opened it and found the trip switch. Flipped it back. The lights came on upstairs. I could hear the hum of the ventilation starting up, and then I heard the door. Not the basement door. A unit door. The rolling metal sound. Opening. I stood there listening. It came from upstairs. 2nd floor. I climbed the steps slowly. When I reached the hallway, all the lights were on. Every unit door was closed, except 212. It was open. Not all the way. Just 2 feet. Enough to see inside. I didn't move. I stood at the top of the stairs and stared at it. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't been on the 2nd floor. I pulled out my phone and called Randy. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I texted him. Door open in C, need you to check cameras. He responded 3 minutes later. No one on feed. Wind? There was no wind. The building was climate controlled. Sealed. I walked down the hallway slowly. My flashlight was still in my hand even though the overheads were on. When I got to 212, I stopped. I didn't go inside. I shined my light through the gap. The boxes had been moved. The path to the back corner was clear now, wide open. And in the back corner, pressed against the wall, there was a sleeping bag, a pillow, a flashlight, a pack of crackers, a bottle of water. Someone had been living there. I pulled the door down so fast I almost caught my hand. I locked it and ran. I didn't go back to the office. I got in my car and called Randy from the parking lot. I told him everything. He said he'd come in. He said to wait. He got there 20 minutes later. We checked the cameras together. No one had entered. No one had left. Not in weeks. We went to Building C together. He brought a crowbar. I brought a flashlight. Unit 212 was locked. We opened it. The boxes were back, stacked exactly as they had been. The path was gone. The sleeping bag was gone. The water bottle. The crackers. All of it. Randy checked every inch of that unit. He pulled boxes down. He checked behind furniture. There was nothing. He told me I'd imagined it. Stressed out. Working nights messes with your head. But I saw his face. He didn't like the silence in there either. I quit 2 days later. Randy didn't try to talk me out of it. I heard later that they auctioned the unit. Someone bought it. I don't know what they found, but I know what I saw. And I know that silence doesn't mean empty. Sometimes it just means something's learned to be still. I used to clean houses. Private clients, mostly. People with money who wanted someone discreet, someone who wouldn't steal or gossip. I was good at it. Thorough. Invisible. One of my regulars was a woman named Mrs. Halford. Big house in the suburbs, 3 floors, more rooms than she used. She was in her 70s. Lived alone. Very particular. I came every Tuesday at 9 a.m. She'd leave a list on the counter and disappear into her upstairs sitting room. I wouldn't see her again until I knocked to say I was done. It was a good arrangement. She paid well. The work wasn't hard. But I never liked the basement. She never asked me to clean it. It wasn't on the list. but I had to go down there to access the utility sink, and every time I did, the silence felt wrong. It was finished, not like a storage basement. Carpeted, painted walls, a few pieces of old furniture. A TV that didn't work. A bookshelf. Nothing creepy. But the air down there felt used, like someone had just left. I mentioned it once to Mrs. Halford, casually. I said the basement stayed cool. Did she ever use it? She looked at me for a long moment and said, "No, I don't go down there." That was it. Subject closed. I didn't push. In November, she went out of town. She called me and asked if I could come on Thursday instead of Tuesday, and if I could stay a little longer. She wanted the windows washed inside and out, and the guest room deep cleaned. Her daughter was visiting for Thanksgiving. I said yes. She left a key under the mat and told me she'd be back Sunday. I got there at 9. The house was cold. She'd turned the heat down. I turned it back up and started on the list. The windows took forever. The guest room was dusty, but not bad. By noon, I was finishing the upstairs bathroom, and I realized I'd run out of glass cleaner. I kept extra supplies in my car, but I'd left the carpet cleaner in the basement the week before. I didn't want to go down there, but I needed it. I opened the basement door and turned on the light. The steps creaked under me. When I got to the bottom, I stood there for a second, just listening. Silence, but not empty. I found the carpet cleaner on the shelf near the utility sink. I grabbed it and turned to go back upstairs. That's when I saw the door. I'd been down there a dozen times and never noticed it. It was in the far corner behind the bookshelf, except the bookshelf had been moved. Just a foot, just enough to make the door visible. It was white, same as the walls. No handle. Just a small keyhole. I stared at it. I told myself it was a closet, storage. Maybe a crawl space. But I didn't believe it. I went upstairs and finished the windows. I tried not to think about it. Mrs. Halford didn't want the basement cleaned. It wasn't my business, but at 2 o'clock I went back down. The bookshelf was heavy, but I moved it a little more. The door was narrow. Maybe 5 feet tall. Old. I tried the handle. Locked. I looked around for a key. I checked the shelf, the drawers in the old desk. Nothing. I should have left. I should have finished my work and gone home. But I went upstairs and checked the kitchen drawers. People always keep spare keys in kitchens. I found one in the back of the junk drawer. Small, brass, old. I took it downstairs and tried it in the lock. It turned. The door opened inward. There were steps. Steep wooden steps going down into darkness. A subbasement. I turned on my phone flashlight and started down. The air smelled like dirt and something else. Something stale. At the bottom there was a room. Maybe 8 feet square. Concrete floor. Concrete walls. A chair in the center. A metal folding chair. And cameras, 3 of them, mounted in the corners. Pointed at the chair. I stood there trying to make sense of it. The cameras weren't on. The room was empty. But there were marks on the floor around the chair. Grooves. Like it had been moved. A lot. And on the wall behind the chair, someone had scratched something into the concrete. Numbers. Dozens of them. Clustered together. Different handwriting. I stepped closer. They were dates. The oldest one I could make out was from 1987. The most recent was from 6 months ago. I backed up. I turned and went up the steps as fast as I could. I closed the door. I locked it. I pushed the bookshelf back. I left the key on the counter. I didn't finish the list. I got in my car and sat there shaking. I thought about calling the police. And saying what? I broke into a locked room in a client's house and found an empty basement with a chair. I didn't go back. I texted Mrs. Halford that I couldn't work for her anymore. Family emergency. She didn't reply. 2 weeks later, I drove past the house. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. The curtains were drawn. I thought about the silence in that basement, the way it felt occupied, and I realized it wasn't that someone had been there. It was that someone had been kept there. I don't clean houses anymore, and I don't go into basements, because silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone who stopped screaming.